Chapter 1 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul tells us what his evangelistic ministry was like. We have Paul the evangelist, Paul the missionary. But in chapters 2 and 3, we find Paul the pastor. You know, we are so accustomed to calling Paul a missionary that we forget he was also a missionary pastor. Paul knew it was not enough to bring the babies into the kingdom, into the family. You have to raise those spiritual children to help them grow in the Lord. So in chapter 2, Paul tells us how he pastored these people, how he encouraged them. In chapter 2, verse 1, Paul writes, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain." It's interesting to notice throughout this letter how often Paul reminds them of what they already knew. Chapter 1, verse 5, "As you know what kind of men we were among you for your sake." And then chapter 2, verse 1 that we just read. And he also repeats it in verse 2, even after we'd suffered before. "As you know, we were bold in our God." Chapter 2, verse 5, "God is witness." Not only were they watching, but God was watching. And right in the middle of verse 5, "We did not use flattering words, as you know." And he says it again down in verse 11, "As you know." Why was he doing this? Because after Paul left town, people started lying about him. Paul had to leave town. I think they probably got a peace bond against him and said, if you come back into town, you're in trouble. Now, Timothy was able to go back, and Timothy was able to minister to the people and help them, but Paul had to leave. And so people were saying to these Christians, "Oh, well, that Paul, what kind of a fellow was he? He came in town, he got you into trouble, he took what money he could take, and away he went." Now, Paul is refuting that. In chapter 2, he tells them, look, remember what we did while we were there. Our coming to you was not in vain. That word in vain means fruitless, empty, no effect, failure. If I had been in Philippi with Paul, they had arrested me, taken away my rights, beaten me, and put me in the inner prison, I don't know if I would have gone to Thessalonica, but Paul did. Paul said, you know that when we came to you, our coming was not in vain. It was not an empty thing. Now, in chapter 2, Paul gives to us the essentials for effective ministry. So many sermons are in vain, it seems. So many services are empty and void of power. So many ministries are simply not making it to the glory of God. Why? Well, we lack some of these essentials. You'll notice in verses 1 and 2, Paul compares himself to an athlete. And in verse 2, he says, "But even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict." Now, the word conflict there gives us our word agony. There's a whole family of words in the Greek language that are translated in our New Testament as conflict, trial, and so forth. Here he's talking about the agony. The word means the agony, the stress, the determination of the athlete as he is running the race. He's saying in verses 1 and 2, when we came, we won you to Christ. Now, as good athletes, we have the kind of toughness that we need to keep going even though the going is tough. Here's the first essential for an effective ministry. We need the toughness of an athlete. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but let me go on to the second essential. Verses 3 through 6, we need the trustworthiness of a steward. Notice verse 4, "But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel." Paul said, I am not only an athlete who is running a race, and I've got the toughness to stick it out, I am also a steward who has been entrusted with the gospel, and I want to be faithful. We need the toughness of the athlete, 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 and 2. We need the trustworthiness of the steward, 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 through 6. Don't stop there, though. We need the tenderness of the parent. It's rather interesting. In verses 7 and 8, he compares himself to a nursing mother. "But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children." Imagine Paul, the great apostle Paul. comparing himself to a nursing mother. Then in verses 9 through 12, he compares himself to a father, an encouraging father. Verse 11, as you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his